December 23, 1944. A converted schoolhouse in Hasselt, Belgium, serving as temporary headquarters for the 21st Army Group. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood before a map of the Ardennes, his trademark beret perched at a precise angle, his eyes tracking the red arrows that represented German panzer divisions now 60 miles deep into Allied lines. 7 days earlier, 3 German armies had erupted through the weakest sector of the American front with a ferocity that stunned even veteran commanders. Over 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, supported by nearly 1,400 tanks and assault guns, had exploited fog, forest, and Allied complacency to create a bulge 50 miles wide in what had been a quiet sector held by inexperienced and exhausted American divisions. The offensive had split the American First and Third Armies, severed critical supply routes, and threatened the vital port of Antwerp. Casualties were mounting by the hour. Entire regiments had been surrounded. The 106th Infantry Division, in combat for less than a week, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. 2 entire regiments, over 8,000 men, had surrendered on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, the largest mass capitulation of American forces in the European theater. The situation was desperate. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had made a battlefield decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He temporarily placed all American forces north of the Bulge, including the 1st and 9th Armies, under British command, under Montgomery's command. It was a practical necessity. Communication lines had been cut. The front had been split. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern shoulder of the penetration than Bradley's. But it was also a decision fraught with political and personal tension that would nearly fracture the Allied coalition at its most vulnerable moment. Montgomery arrived at the First Army headquarters in Chaude-Fontaine on December 20th. What happened next would become one of the most controversial episodes of the entire war. According to multiple American officers present, Montgomery entered the room with what one described as the air of Christ, come to cleanse the temple. He immediately began issuing orders, reorganizing defensive positions, and critiquing American dispositions with a bluntness that bordered on contempt. He told Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army, that the Americans had been caught napping, that their intelligence had failed, that their dispositions had been amateurish. He announced that he was tidying up the battlefield. The phrase would be repeated, resented, and remembered for decades. Montgomery's assessment wasn't entirely wrong. American intelligence had missed clear indicators of the German buildup. Defensive positions in the Ardennes had been thinly held, a calculated risk based on the assumption that the terrain was too difficult for a major offensive. Eisenhower himself had approved that disposition. But Montgomery's delivery, his tone, his apparent satisfaction at being called in to rescue the Americans ignited a fury that spread rapidly through the command structure. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and Montgomery's peer, was livid. He saw the temporary command arrangement not as a tactical necessity, but as a British power grab, with Montgomery positioning himself to claim credit for stopping the German offensive. Bradley told Eisenhower that if Montgomery retained command of American forces after the crisis passed, he would ask to be relieved. It wasn't an idle threat. Bradley commanded over 900,000 American soldiers. His resignation would trigger a political earthquake in Washington. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you've heard this story before. The tension between Eisenhower and Montgomery shaped not just the Battle of the Bulge, but the entire final phase of the war in Europe. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think of Montgomery's approach. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the command decisions that shaped history, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. These stories take serious research, and knowing that people are watching and engaging makes it all worthwhile. The roots of the conflict ran far deeper than a single meeting in Belgium. Montgomery and Eisenhower had been clashing, politely but persistently, since the invasion of Normandy 6 months earlier. The fundamental disagreement was strategic. Montgomery believed in concentration of force. He wanted a single powerful thrust into Germany, a narrow front strategy that would mass Allied armor and infantry into one unstoppable spearhead aimed directly at Berlin. He believed he should command that thrust. Eisenhower believed in a broad front strategy, advancing along the entire line from Switzerland to the North Sea, applying pressure everywhere, preventing the Germans from concentrating their reserves against a single point of attack. It was a debate between risk and certainty, between boldness and prudence, between the British way of war, shaped by limited manpower and imperial overstretch, and the American way of war, shaped by industrial abundance and a willingness to accept casualties that British public opinion would not tolerate. Montgomery had proposed Operation Market Garden in September, the audacious airborne assault intended to seize bridges across the Rhine and open a corridor into the German industrial heartland. Eisenhower had approved it, giving Montgomery the resources and priority he demanded. The operation had failed. The British 1st Airborne Division had been destroyed at Arnhem. Over 1,400 men killed, nearly 6,500 captured. The failure had vindicated Eisenhower's caution and undermined Montgomery's credibility, but Montgomery had not accepted that verdict. He continued to argue for a single thrust, continued to criticize the broad front, continued to imply that if only Eisenhower had given him everything he asked for, the war would already be over. Now, in the chaos of the Ardennes, Montgomery saw an opportunity. Not to rescue the Americans, though he would do that competently, but to prove that his strategic vision had been correct all along. On December 29th, Montgomery sent Eisenhower a message that would push their relationship to the breaking point. He proposed that Eisenhower appoint a single ground forces commander for all Allied armies, a commander who would have operational control independent of Eisenhower's oversight. He didn't explicitly say that he should be that commander, but the implication was unmistakable. He argued that the current command structure, with Eisenhower trying to coordinate multiple army groups from a headquarters in Versailles, was inefficient and had contributed to the disaster in the Ardennes. He suggested that Eisenhower was stretched too thin, that he needed to focus on the political and logistical aspects of supreme command and leave battlefield decisions to a professional soldier. The message was professionally phrased, but its subtext was clear. Montgomery was saying that Eisenhower, who had never commanded troops in combat before World War II, whose career had been built on staff work and planning rather than battlefield leadership, was not competent to manage the ground war. He was saying that the Ardennes offensive had happened because Eisenhower's broad front strategy had dispersed Allied strength, leaving the Americans vulnerable. He was saying that British generalship was superior to American generalship, and that the alliance would be better served if a British officer, specifically Bernard Law Montgomery, controlled the land campaign. Eisenhower read the message on December 30th. His reaction was immediate and uncharacteristic. Eisenhower was a coalition builder, a diplomat in uniform, a man whose greatest skill was managing egos and maintaining unity among allies with competing interests and historical resentments. He had spent 2 years smoothing over disputes, deflecting criticism, absorbing blame to protect subordinates. But Montgomery's message crossed a line. Eisenhower drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff, the joint American-British command authority that oversaw the war. The cable presented a stark choice: Either Montgomery would be ordered to stop questioning the command structure and follow Eisenhower's directives without public or private dissent, or Eisenhower would resign. He wrote that he was not indispensable, that if the combined chiefs believed a change in command was necessary, he would step aside without complaint. But he would not continue to serve as Supreme Commander if his authority was going to be systematically undermined by a subordinate who believed himself better qualified for the job. The cable was never sent. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, read the draft and immediately recognized the catastrophic consequences that would follow. If Eisenhower resigned, the alliance would fracture. American public opinion, already skeptical of British motives and resentful of what many saw as British arrogance, would explode. The political pressure to reduce or eliminate American support for British operations would become irresistible. The carefully constructed partnership that had made D-Day possible, that had sustained the campaign across France, that had held together through disagreements over Italy, southern France, and the pursuit across the Rhine, would collapse. Smith took the cable and locked it in his safe. Then he contacted British Major General Francis de Guingand, Montgomery's Chief of Staff, and one of the few officers who could influence Montgomery's behavior. De Guingand flew to Eisenhower's headquarters on December 31st. Smith showed him the draft cable. De Guingand understood instantly. He flew back to Montgomery's headquarters and told him bluntly that he was about to be sacked. Montgomery was stunned. He had not intended to challenge Eisenhower's authority. He had been offering professional military advice. He believed his strategic analysis was sound. He believed that Eisenhower, as a reasonable man and a competent officer, would see the logic of his proposal. De Guingand explained that intent didn't matter. Perception mattered. The Americans perceived Montgomery's message as insubordination. Bradley had already threatened to resign. Patton, who despised Montgomery and had clashed with him repeatedly, was waiting for an excuse to escalate the confrontation. If Eisenhower went to the combined chiefs, the British would be forced to choose between supporting their most famous field commander and preserving the alliance, and they would choose the alliance. Churchill needed American power to win the war and secure Britain's position in the post-war world. He would sacrifice Montgomery without hesitation if that was the price of keeping Eisenhower in command and keeping American divisions fighting in Europe. Montgomery, for perhaps the first time in the campaign, backed down. He sent Eisenhower a message on January 1st, 1945. He apologized for any misunderstanding. He expressed complete confidence in Eisenhower's leadership. He pledged his full support for whatever strategy Eisenhower chose to pursue. The message was everything Eisenhower needed. It was public, it was unambiguous, and it gave Eisenhower the political cover to keep Montgomery in command of the 21st Army Group without appearing weak or indecisive. But the damage had been done. Eisenhower never fully trusted Montgomery again. More importantly, the confrontation forced Eisenhower to make a decision he had been avoiding. He had to choose between Montgomery's narrow front and his own broad front strategy, not as an abstract debate between two reasonable approaches, but as a test of his authority and his judgment. He chose the broad front. In early January, as the German offensive collapsed under the weight of American reinforcements and relentless Allied air power, Eisenhower issued orders for the final campaign into Germany. There would be no single thrust. There would be coordinated advances across the entire front. Montgomery would attack across the Rhine in the north. Bradley would attack through the center. The American 6th Army Group under General Jacob Devers would advance in the south. No single commander would have priority. No single axis of advance would receive the lion's share of resources. Eisenhower's decision was not purely strategic, it was also political. He could not give Montgomery the primacy he demanded without triggering a revolt among American commanders and a backlash in Washington. The broad front strategy allowed Eisenhower to distribute success and credit across the entire coalition. It ensured that American forces would play the dominant role in the final defeat of Germany, a role proportional to the size of the American commitment. By April 1945, American forces in Europe numbered over 3,000 soldiers, more than twice the size of British and Canadian forces combined. The broad front reflected that reality. Montgomery's performance during the Bulge had been competent. He had stabilized the northern shoulder of the German penetration, positioned British reserves to block any breakthrough toward Antwerp, and coordinated the American counterattacks that eventually sealed off the salient. But he had also made a critical public relations blunder. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference. He described the battle in terms that suggested British forces had played the decisive role in stopping the German offensive. He praised the American soldiers who had fought under his command, but he did so in a way that implied they had needed British leadership to succeed. He said that as soon as he saw what was happening, he took certain steps to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was clear. Montgomery was claiming credit. The American press erupted. Editorials accused Montgomery of grandstanding, of minimizing American sacrifices, of trying to rescue his reputation after the failure of Market Garden by exaggerating his role in the Ardennes. Churchill was forced to intervene. He gave a speech in the House of Commons on January 18th, explicitly praising American leadership and American soldiers, making it clear that the battle had been an American victory won primarily by American forces. "The care I take is in no way to disparage the share of our British and Canadian troops," Churchill said, "but the glory of this battle must go to the United States Army." It was a humiliating rebuke delivered by Montgomery's own prime minister, and it marked the end of Montgomery's influence over Allied strategy. The lesson isn't that Montgomery was wrong about concentration of force. Military theorists still debate whether a narrow front strategy might have ended the war sooner, might have allowed the Western Allies to reach Berlin before the Soviets, might have changed the political map of post-war Europe. The lesson is that in coalition warfare, competence is not enough. You must manage perceptions, you must share credit, you must subordinate your professional judgment to the political requirements of the alliance. Montgomery was a skilled tactician and a meticulous planner. His preparations for D-Day were instrumental in the success of the invasion. His caution, which American commanders found frustrating, prevented costly failures. But he never understood that Eisenhower's greatest challenge was not operational. It was political. Eisenhower had to hold together an alliance of nations with different strategic cultures, different tolerance for casualties, different post-war ambitions. He had to balance the egos of commanders who believed they were better qualified than their peers. He had to manage public opinion in democracies where popular support could evaporate if the war seemed to be mismanaged or if one ally seemed to be exploiting another. Montgomery saw these concerns as distractions from the pure military problem of defeating Germany as quickly as possible. Eisenhower understood that the pure military problem could not be separated from the political context in which it was embedded. That understanding, more than any battlefield decision, was why Eisenhower was supreme commander and Montgomery was not. By March 1945, the broad front was advancing into Germany on schedule. Montgomery crossed the Rhine on March 23rd in Operation Plunder, a meticulously planned assault supported by the largest airborne operation since D-Day. Bradley's forces had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th, seizing an intact bridge in an opportunistic coup that Eisenhower immediately exploited. Patton crossed at Oppenheim on March 22nd, a day before Montgomery, and made sure the press knew it. The three axes of advance converged on the Ruhr, encircling over 300,000 German soldiers in the largest encirclement of the war in the West. By April, organized German resistance was collapsing. On May 4th, Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The war in Europe ended 4 days later. Montgomery would later write in his memoirs that Eisenhower's broad front strategy had prolonged the war, that a concentrated thrust in the fall of 1944 could have ended the conflict before Christmas. He never accepted that his own failures, his inability to break out of the Normandy bridgehead quickly, his failure at Arnhem, his confrontational approach to coalition command, had undermined his credibility and made it politically impossible for Eisenhower to give him the resources and authority he demanded. Eisenhower, characteristically, never publicly criticized Montgomery. In his own memoirs, he praised Montgomery's professionalism and his contributions to the victory. But in private correspondence, years after the war, Eisenhower admitted that the winter of 1944 had been the most difficult period of his command, not because of the German offensive, but because of the strain of managing Montgomery's ambitions while preserving the alliance. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery is a case study in the limits of military genius. Montgomery was, by any objective measure, one of the finest operational commanders of the Second World War. His victory at El Alamein in 1942 had been the first major British land victory of the war. His planning for D-Day had been meticulous and effective. His management of the Normandy breakout, though slower than American commanders wanted, had been methodical and ultimately successful. But genius, in war as in any other field, must operate within constraints. Montgomery's constraint was political. He was the senior British commander in a coalition increasingly dominated by American power. He could not dictate strategy. He could not claim resources that American public opinion would not support allocating to a British commander. He could not publicly criticize the Supreme Commander without triggering a crisis that would end his career. Eisenhower understood those constraints. He understood that his job was not to be the best tactician or the most aggressive commander. His job was to hold the coalition together, to keep American, British, and Canadian forces fighting as a unified force, to manage the egos and ambitions of subordinates who believed they could do his job better than he could. He succeeded. The alliance held. The broad front advanced. Germany surrendered. And Montgomery, for all his brilliance, learned that in coalition warfare, the officer who understands politics will always outrank the officer who understands only tactics. That lesson echoes through military history, from the Napoleonic Wars to the present day. Superior strategy matters. Superior tactics matter. But in the final analysis, the ability to manage allies, to share credit, to subordinate personal ambition to collective success matters more. Eisenhower had that ability. Montgomery did not. And that, more than any battle, is why Eisenhower's name is remembered as the architect of victory in Europe, and Montgomery's is remembered with an asterisk.